My name is Colette Joyce. I'm a member of the WOW Steering Committee from England. I've been involved for 6 years. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce this morning's guest from the UK, Professor Tina Beattie. 12 months ago, I was present at Tina's seminar when she reported back on the first Synod of the Family, and she declared that she would dedicate this year to raising the missing voices of women. She's done so spectacularly with her new book, Catholic Women Speak, which is due to be launched in Rome on the 1st of October with guests including Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland. 44 Catholic women from around the world have contributed to this book, many of them in this room. We congratulate you. Giving a theological and personal perspective to a wide variety of issues concerning motherhood, divorce, marriage, same-sex relationships, religious and single life. A copy of the book will be given to every bishop participating at the second Synod of the Family. We in the UK are very proud of Tina for lifting our voices in this way. We're not challenging the powers that be. Tina is Professor of Catholic Studies and Director of the Centre for Religion, Society and Human Flourishing at the University of Roehampton in London. She's researched and written on a variety of issues: Marian theology, theology, art and mysticism, embodiment and sacramentality, and all her work addresses the theological significance of gender. Her recent research has been into the arena of development, religion, and maternal and feminine well-being, uniting all the themes of our conference. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Tina Beattie.
This really is the moment of birth, because I've only just been to FedEx and collected a box of these books. So I'm delighted and privileged to be with everybody here today and to talk at this really important and historical event. However, I must start by acknowledging a real debt of gratitude, because for many years I've grappled with the issues we're addressing here today, and I did have an epiphany a few months ago when I read a very special and moving interview in an online journal called The New Evangelization. I understand so clearly now what I didn't see before, and I'm deeply indebted to Cardinal Raymond Burke for his wisdom and insight. I had never realized that a cappa magna could look like the labia of a woman's vagina, but there you go. And of course, why didn't we think of this? It seems so obvious. But thank God we have someone to just clarify those little questions that eat away at us. So, given that I've had a conversion experience, I'm going to begin this paper by giving a fairly straightforward account of the development of gender theory and the Vatican's reaction to it in official church teaching. Then I'm going to consider church teaching regarding the sacramental priesthood in the context of gender. And finally, I'm going to look at some examples of medieval art in order to explore ways in which the body of Christ might be mapped according to maternal and paternal bodily functions, opening up a wider understanding of incarnation, gender, and priesthood. So it's a kind of gendered polymorphous playfulness, to put it in postmodern ease. And if there are any squeamish priests in this room, I'm sure there aren't, because if you were a squeamish priest, you probably wouldn't be here. Someone's waving. They're not squeamish priests. Can't hear me? Am I talking too fast? Okay, I'll slow down. Just wave again if I speed up. So, but yes, if you are a squeamish priest, you might want to leave now, or don't say you haven't been warned. So the first part of my paper, I tell it straight. In the second part, I tell it slant, following Emily Dickinson's advice to tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And in the third part, I show it. In the early 1990s, the language of sexuality and sexual rights began to feature in international debates about human rights, prompted largely by the influence of feminist and gay lobbies that emerged from the late 1960s. This had a dampening effect on the growing support by the Catholic Church for universal human rights, eloquently expressed in Pope John XXIII's 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, which in my view remains one of the best documents written on the idea of universal human rights. At the 1994 Cairo Conference on Population and Development, a bitter confrontation erupted between delegates of the Holy See and secular feminists and rights campaigners. The Cairo Conference was the first major battle in an increasingly hostile war. A year after Cairo, in 1995, feminist activists went to the UN's Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing with renewed determination to lobby for the inclusion of sexual rights. Meanwhile, Pope John Paul II did a great deal to promote a more positive image of the Church's engagement with women's rights in the run-up to the Beijing conference. The Holy See's delegation to Beijing was led by Harvard Law professor and human rights lawyer Mary Ann Glendon, before she went over to enjoy tea parties with politicians, and included Catherine Hawa Hukwamp, a former Nigerian health official. However, the damage done in Cairo wouldn't easily be forgotten or forgiven. The battle lines were drawn, and while its interventions and reservations were more temperate than those at Cairo, the Holy See continued to function as a tenacious opponent of those who would use the UN to promote a sexual rights agenda, to sanction abortion or homosexuality, or to undermine marriage and the sexual complementarity of male and female. With regard to the latter, a particular surprise to sexual rights campaigners at Beijing was the Holy See's decision to target the language of gender. In her closing statement on behalf of the Holy See, Glendon gives partial support to the Beijing Platform of Action, saying that on a number of issues such as poverty, literacy, and education, there's close correspondence with Catholic social teaching. The statement registers numerous reservations to do with the language of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and it introduces a qualification with regard to the language of gender, limiting it to heterosexual identities and relationships. And here is the relevant passage from that statement. The term gender is understood by the Holy See as grounded in biological sexual identity, male or female. Furthermore, the Platform for Action itself clearly uses the term both genders. The Holy See thus excludes dubious interpretations based on worldviews which assert that sexual identity can be adapted indefinitely to suit new and different purposes. It also dissociates itself from the biological determinist notion that all the roles and relations of the two sexes are fixed in a single static pattern. Now, one feminist observer, François Girard, points out that the Holy See's argument about the hidden meaning of gender highlighted its understanding of contemporary debates about sexuality. While most governments and feminist activists at the negotiations were in fact using gender in accordance with contemporary political usage as a proxy for women, the Holy See recognized the far-reaching implications of detaching social roles, identities, and expressions from biological sex. She describes the Holy See's preemptive move as an acknowledgement that fluid or multiple gender identities or expressions, transgender, cross-gender, queer, bring into question the very notion of binary categories like woman, man, or femininity, masculinity, and of preordained social roles. Paradoxically, then, Girard is suggesting that it was the Vatican's foresightedness that partly inspired the gender movement. So Beijing is a marker from which we can begin to track the entrenched resistance to gender theory or gender ideology that has been a feature of the Church's teachings since the late 1960s. And Julie Clegg, my colleague in the UK, has put together a list of papal statements and official statements that express a concern with issues of gender. And you can see that it starts in 1995, 4 years after the Beijing conference, and makes explicit reference to that conference. So this is when gender ideology enters the small sphere of the Vatican's urgent and pressing concerns. And I'm not going to read them all out, but you can go through and see that this concern continues. This wonderful letter on the collaboration of men and women in the church, written to the bishops by a group of celibate bishops with nothing to say about men and everything to say about the problems feminists and gender theorists are causing for the men in the church. And one of Pope Francis's rather disappointing characteristics, perhaps, is to continue in a more muted tone this anxiety about gender theory. So it continues. There is, however, a creative and mutually illuminating engagement between gender theory and Christian theology in the work of many theologians. Anglican theologian and priest Sarah Coakley argues that only systematic theology of a particular sort can adequately and effectively respond to the rightful critiques that gender studies and political and liberation theology have laid at its door. And only gender studies, inversely, and its accompanying political insights can thus properly reanimate systematic theology for the future. Elaborating upon the theological potential of gender awareness, Coakley argues that modern theologians misread the emergent Trinitarian theologians of the 4th and 5th centuries because they fail to recognize how intricately questions of God were bound up with questions of desire, sexuality, and gender. Sandra Lipsitz-Behm refers to the lenses of gender to describe how cultural constructs perpetuate different concepts of gender. Behm writes of the need to render those lenses visible rather than invisible, to enable us to look at the culture's gender lenses rather than through them. Theologians such as Coakley and many others, including myself, explore the new perspectives that open up when we become aware of how theology has been influenced by the invisible lenses of gender, and when we seek different possibilities for the interpretation of gendered Christian doctrines and their anthropological, sacramental, and ethical applications by making those lenses visible. The work of Thomas Laqueur is of particular significance here. Laqueur identifies two overlapping master plots in Western culture: a one-sex model found in pre-modern texts in which the female body is understood as an inferior anatomical variation on the male body, and a post-Enlightenment two-sex model in which biological differences are interpreted in terms of essential physiological differences between women and men. Laqueur argues that in pre-Enlightenment texts, and even some later ones, sex, or the body, must be understood as the epiphenomenon, while gender, what we would take to be a cultural category, was primary or real. Laqueur also argues that anatomy in the context of sexual difference was a representational strategy that illuminated a more stable, extracorporeal reality. There existed many genders, but only one adaptable sex. Laqueur is disappointingly vague when it comes to theology, but he invites us to recognize that the Catholic tradition has for most of its history understood gender rather than sex as the organizing framework within which to interpret human and divine relationships in terms of sexual hierarchies, erotic love, and maternal and paternal characteristics. So now I move on to gender and the sacramental priesthood, and I'm going to apply the lenses of gender to the Church's teaching, focusing, and here I begin to tell the truth but tell it slant, and I'm going to focus on Pope John Paul II's 1988 apostolic letter, Mulieris Dignitatem, addressed to women, in which he seeks to explain the reasons for the exclusive masculinity of the priesthood in a way that implies no denigration or exclusion of women. Mulieris Dignitatem goes to considerable lengths to affirm the full equality and dignity of woman. The dualistic contrast between Mary and Eve, which has been such a feature of Christian theology, yields to a more integrated approach. The theme of Eve's desire and domination is used not as an expression of blame and punishment, but to point to the historical injustices suffered by women. Although his vision of womanhood was highly romanticized and essentialized, John Paul II had a keen awareness of the extent to which women have been victims of injustice and oppression throughout history. Mulieris Dignitatem affirms the essential equality of man and woman from the point of view of their humanity. The woman, it says, is another I in a common humanity. It lists numerous ways in which the Bible refers to God in both masculine and feminine terms and insists on the analogical nature of all such language. For example, the eternal generating, which belongs to the inner life of God, has neither masculine nor feminine qualities. It is totally divine and possesses no property typical of the body. Even fatherhood in God is completely divine and free of the masculine bodily characteristics proper to human fatherhood. While humankind is like God, and therefore in some sense God is like the human and therefore can be known, God is also, says Pope Francis, the totally other. This is all rich food for thought. But I have for some years struggled with what seems to be an inconsistency in the language of gender in Mulieris Dignitatem. It seems to function analogically in some places and literally in others, with no attempt to explain why this should be so. In other words, it begins to look rather like gender ideology. And I use the word ideology to suggest that gender is functioning here for the subtle purposes of exclusion and control, rather than as a transparent attempt to grapple with the ways in which desire, gender, and meaning intersect in the context of human embodiment and divine sacramentality, which is the aim of theories and theologies of gender as distinct from secular or religious ideologies. So John Paul says that as woman, Mary is the representative and archetype of the whole human race. She represents the humanity which belongs to all human beings, both men and women. Her motherhood is a model and type of the motherhood of the Church. Okay, so we have a maternal feminine gender associated not with the female body, but with the human condition and with the motherhood of the Church. One gender, start counting. So the bride is, says John Paul II, a collective subject, a community made up of many persons, in such a way that all human beings, both women and men, are called through the Church to be the bride of Christ. In this way, being the bride and thus the feminine element becomes a symbol of all that is human. Are you still counting? However, then the text offers a more exclusive portrayal of Mary as signifying the fullness of the perfection of what is characteristic of woman, of what is feminine. She is the culminating point, the archetype of the personal dignity of woman. So we seem to have another gender, a feminine gender associated with woman, which appears exclusive of men. We are in the realm of genders that seem to go forth and multiply. Then we go to masculine genders. Christ is the bridegroom, whose attitude towards women serves as a model of what the letter to the Ephesians expresses with the concept of bridegroom. Precisely because Christ's divine love is the love of a bridegroom, it is the model and pattern of all human love, men's love in particular. So several more genders are appearing over the scene. However, apparently, it's the masculine gender of the bridegroom that enables us to understand why only men are called apostles. Against the broad background of the great mystery expressed in the spousal relationship between Christ and the Church, it is apparently possible to understand adequately the calling of the 12. In calling only men as his apostles, Christ acted in a completely free and sovereign manner. This gendered symbolic ecclesiology is summed up as follows. So I think I've lost track of the number of genders we now have. There are genders associated with sexed male and female bodies in a rather literal reading of Genesis, but in the mystery of Christ and the Church, these become prismatic and open to several different configurations. Men can be brides, but women can never be bridegrooms, except with regard to the ways in which humans love. There's neither masculinity nor femininity in God, and divine generativity is not to be identified with human sexual procreation, but nevertheless, as bridegroom, Christ is masculine, and that which is feminine can never occupy the position of the masculine. Femininity embraces a complex array of gendered identities, referring to female bodies as virgins, mothers, and brides, but also to male bodies. It refers collectively to humankind and to the church, but masculinity refers exclusively and only to the male body, which represents the bridegroom, Christ. So how do we square this with another passage in Mulieris Dignitatem, where John Paul II observes that while the God of the Old Testament sometimes addressed women, to make his covenant with humanity, he addressed himself only to men, Noah, Abraham, and Moses. At the beginning of the new covenant, which is eternal and irrevocable, there is a woman, the Virgin of Nazareth. It's a sign that points to the fact that in Jesus Christ there is neither male nor female. In Christ, the mutual opposition between man and woman, the inheritance of original sin, is essentially overcome. For you are all one in Jesus Christ, says St. Paul. We might ask if in choosing to appear first to a woman after the resurrection, Christ intended to say something about the role of women as preachers and apostles. Mary Magdalene was, after all, known as the apostle to the apostles in the early church, and there are many medieval images of her preaching. But I chose it because actually, contrary to many of these images, it's impossible to say, no, that's just her telling of the resurrection. This shows Mary Magdalene in a pulpit preaching to men, women, and children in the role of a preacher. More familiar images, like this beautiful one, can be interpreted in a narrower way, but I'm not at all sure that they were intended to be. So if there's neither male nor female, and if Christ and the church are, in the words of Ephesians, one flesh, could we not say that male and female bodies together manifest the risen body of Christ as the fullness of the human redeemed in the flesh of Christ? After all, Gregory of Nazianzus tells us that what was not assumed is not redeemed, so there must be some sense in which Christ's flesh assumes female as well as male bodiliness. Watch this space. So, still on the theme of gendered priestly bodies, let's move on to Pope Francis, who has told us that the door remains closed to women's ordination. In Evangelii Gaudium, Francis writes about homiletics under the title, A Mother's Conversation. The Church preaches in the same way that a mother speaks to her child. The Christian faith must be communicated, he says, in our mother culture, our native language, in a setting that is both maternal and ecclesial. This enculturated preaching requires a synthesis, says Francis, that comes from the passionate heart of the preacher rather than ideas or detached values. Now, here I admit to being somewhat perplexed, for surely the idea of the priest speaking as a mother in a role from which female bodies are prohibited is somewhat detached from any incarnate maternal context. According to canon law, only priests and deacons are permitted to preach the homily during Mass, so women can't initiate the mother's conversation that is the homily. Elsewhere, Francis speaks of the fleshy devotions of popular religiosity, but female fleshiness bars women from speaking when the maternal body is heard in the context of the Mass, which is at the very heart of Catholic devotional life. Okay. I'm going to move on from gender theory to some of the philosophical underpinnings that might inform these gendered theological visions. I've grappled with this for many years, and as a convert to Catholicism, one of the reasons that attracted me was the relationship between faith and reason, which is such a sound underpinning of the Catholic tradition. It's not to say that every revealed mystery of faith is accessible to reason alone, but it is to say that we can start from those mysteries and think reasonably about their implications and their meanings. We can never persuade someone by appeal to philosophy alone to believe in mysteries like the Trinity or the Incarnation, but we can persuade them that we're not being irrational when we ourselves believe in them. I can't persuade you to love my husband, but I can persuade you that I'm not being irrational when I live in a marriage in ways that show I love him. And if we can't explain the mysteries of faith in a way that satisfies at least some of the demands of reason, then I'm afraid we're in the realm not of mystery but of mystification. So, what are the philosophical as well as the mystical underpinnings of the exclusive masculinity of the sacramental priesthood? Now I'm going to meander along a somewhat exploratory and hypothetical path. From the beginning, and particularly since the emergence of Aristotelianism in the medieval universities, scriptural revelation has been interpreted in the context of a dualistic Greek ontology in which the copulative relationship between paternal form and maternal matter is the basic building block of creation. Inseminating form acts upon receptive matter in order to bring the world of differentiated bodies into being, and the etymology of matter derives from mother. This gendered account of the nature of being encompasses all that is, and it has profoundly shaped the Western understanding of gender. Form is associated with fatherhood, perfection, order, beauty, rationality, and therefore with spirit and the divine, while matter is associated with lack, chaos, passivity, materiality, and therefore with nature and motherhood. From Plato to Kant to Freud, a horrified fascination with the viscous maternal stuff of formless matter has haunted the philosophical imagination. Starting with the authors of Genesis, men have for millennia tried to account for their existence in ways that avoid recognizing that they arrived in the world from the fleshy womb of a woman's body by way of a woman's vagina. The gendered copulative relationship between form and matter had a formative influence on the Western social order and sexual hierarchies, and its influence continues long after the science has been discredited. To see its social impact, we might consider Thomas Aquinas' argument as to why a child should love its father more than its mother, despite the fact that its mother gave it life and cared for it. The father should be loved more than the mother, for father and mother are loved as principles of our natural origin. Now, the father is principal in a more excellent way than the mother, because he is the active principle, while the mother is a passive and material principle. Consequently, strictly speaking, the father is to be loved more. In the begetting of man, the mother supplies the formless matter of the body, and the latter receives its form through the formative power that is the semen of the father. And though this power cannot create the rational soul, yet it disposes the matter of the body to receive that form. The point there is that the soul actually comes from God in the human, not from the semen, but the semen plays a part in preparing it. I find myself wondering how much this anachronistic but still potent belief in the formative power of the father, formative inseminating note power of the father, and the formless materiality of the maternal body is deeply rooted in the Church's understanding of consecration and transubstantiation. Matter cannot act upon matter. Only form can act upon matter. Only form can initiate an inseminating process through which a material body is transformed in its essence while still appearing in its former guise. In other words, only the man who represents inseminating form can transform the materiality of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. We might argue that female bodies are also integrated dualities of form and matter, Or we might argue that the whole opening up of modern physics and quantum theory shows that this account of the nature of being is no longer valid, but the superstition persists long after the science has exposed its errors. This is surely also why masculinity acquires such definitive status, while femininity is the blurry, formless materiality that lends itself to being male brides, female brides, collective brides, child brides even. The singular phallus of an inseminating God, essentially identified with the phallic priesthood, can inseminate a multitude of cross-dressing gendered bodies. Closely related to the fear of primordial chaos, of formless matter associated with nature and the maternal, is the fear of blood. Theorists such as Nancy Jay, and from a different perspective René Girard, argue that sacrifice constitutes a form of controlled bloodletting, allowing for the carefully regulated expression of violence and death as a way of mastering natural forces and ordering them towards the divine. However, the female body naturally bleeds in a way that is beyond human control, evoking associations with both the chaos of nature and the dangerous power of sex, birth, and death. Jay argues that in rituals where sacrificial blood symbolism still occupies an important role, there's likely to be greater resistance to women's priestly participation than in those which involve blood sacrifice. This might be why some Protestant churches have been more open to women's ordination than Catholic and Orthodox churches, which retain a strong element of cultic sacrificial language and ritual. In my own work, I've done extensive research on the difference gender makes to the symbolic significance of blood. When a man says, "This is my body, this is my blood," it inevitably evokes images of wounding and death, because men's bodies only bleed when they're wounded. However, female bodies have a more complex and semantically rich relationship to blood, for blood is a sign of birth and fertility, as well as death and injury. When a woman says, "This is my body, this is my blood," the words open the sacramental perception of gender to a wide range of potential meanings associated with birth as well as death, fecundity as well as sacrifice. These are key themes for the work of theorists such as Luce Irigaray, who argues that the masculine religious imaginary is sacrificial and yearns for transcendence and disembodiment, while a maternal religious imaginary, were it to exist, might tend more to fecundity, embodiment, and desire. Now, however much we look at these things through the lenses of gender intellectually, we can't escape the fact that we are all deeply culturally impregnated with these conditioned understandings of gender. One does not shrug off a long history that long predates the arrival of Christianity on the scene in one generation or two generations of feminist scholarship and practice. So this brings me to think, however much we know in our heads, Mass worship is a deeply experiential, intimate, personal, and communal experience of seeking God in the gestures and rituals of our material lives. This leads me to wonder if possibly these dualisms I've been speaking about are subtly but profoundly inscribed in the sacramental priesthood, with its insistence upon the significance of the phallus for the valid performance of the liturgy. Is the Mass still in some ancient but also postmodern way being interpreted as a fertility rite representing divine phallic insemination of a receptive and formless materiality? Let's hold that question, because the most important question I want to ask is, do men and women experience the Mass differently? That's a huge question, and there are as many men and women as there are individuals, so let's focus it a bit. Do priests experience the Mass differently from women and maybe many men? Or even we can focus it a little bit more closely. Do bishops experience the Mass a little bit differently from ordinary men and women? Well, maybe. I don't know how many of you experience the Mass like this. For when you see the Lord's sacrifice laid upon the altar, and the priest standing and praying over the victim, and all the worshippers empurpled with that precious blood, imagine if it were menstrual blood, can you then think that you are, I'm coming back to that, can you then think that you are still among men and standing upon the earth? Are you not, on the contrary, straightway translated to heaven, and casting out every carnal thought from the soul, do you not, with disembodied spirit and pure reason, contemplate the things which are in heaven? Now, that's a 2004 document, and who am I to question the authority of the bishops? So with all due respect, your graces, I don't think we gals quite see it like that. I mean, please do. I'm not trying to change things, I'm just saying. So, if we bring the lens of gender to bear on this, we might be justified in saying, how can a woman possibly relate to this desire for disembodied spirit and pure reason, i.e. form, when for all of Christian history she's been culturally and theologically conditioned to see herself in terms of carnality and desire? We might also ask, with all due respect, how this longing for disembodiment and reason can be squared with the fleshy vulnerability and sensual love of the incarnate Christ, whose body and blood we receive in the Eucharist. Let's just go with all this and see where it takes us. Carolyn Walker Bynum reminds us that in the Middle Ages, medieval women could use this duality of form and matter, divine spirit and maternal flesh, to their spiritual and theological advantage. If Christ's divine spirit was form, masculine, of the Father, his human flesh was feminine, maternal, of his mother. There was no man on the scene. So Christ's humanity was female and his divinity was possibly male. Moreover, in the Eucharist, we receive Christ's body and blood as food and drink. It's maternal bodies that feed other bodies. So this is the bit where, if you're a priest here, I'm so glad you're here, genuinely. That's not an ironic or sarcastic comment. I am genuinely glad you're here. But when you stand behind the altar, if you are imagining that kind of nice disembodiment, that's fine, but maybe you could just switch genders once or twice so that you truly do represent the risen Christ for all of us. And I'm going to help you to do that now. So, I'm a great respecter, as I've already said, of Cardinal Raymond Burke, and I also have a deep theological devotion to Hans Urs von Balthasar. I spent 5 years studying him, and believe me, ladies, he is so sexy. I mean, really. If you're into 50 Shades of Grey, Christian Grey has nothing on von Balthasar's Christ. I can give you some reading, believe me. If you're into bondage and rape and all that kind of stuff, von Balthasar's Jesus might do it for you. So, I've been in a lot of trouble for quoting a passage from von Balthasar that has particularly inspired me, though people seem not to notice I'm quoting von Balthasar, and bloggers will assure you that dissenting theologian Tina Beattie compares the Mass to a male orgasm. But really, that's shooting the messenger. And we are talking about shooting. Whoosh! Dream on, guys. I don't want to challenge this. Von Balthasar is the theologian of choice still in many seminaries, huge influence on theology of the body. In this context, seminaries are very appropriately named. And I've been told by some priests that they do indeed see their roles in this kind of way. I've been shouted at loudly by other very angry priests for daring to suggest it, which is revealing this. Now, as I say, I'm an admirer of von Balthasar, so I really want to take responsibility for promoting his work and showing people how it really does work. So here was my next problem. Is Jesus guilty of the kind of upside-down version of the sin of Onan? Maybe spilling his seed not quite on the earth, but up into the air, because to be fertile, seed needs somewhere to go. It can't just go on an upward trajectory towards the Father, or it hasn't produced much. So we all know where that limited organ needs to be put if the seed is to bear fruit. So we're going to go on a little journey, a little time traveling now, to a strange era in medieval art that kind of goes from the 13th to the 14th, 15th century, and then I guess the Reformation gave them all other things to think about. But clearly, Balthasar isn't, as I used to think, introducing something new to the theological tradition. People have been here before, and they weren't as coy as we are. They didn't mind asking the questions. So I've called this final part of my paper The Wise Wound. Reflecting on von Balthasar, I began to realize how many ancient crucifixes have whopping great phalluses in the middle of Jesus' torso. There's one in the National Gallery in London, and I was doing a radio programme with a BBC journalist, and I stopped before this priceless 13th century wooden crucifix and said to her, "Look, it's quite obvious." And she said, "Oh my goodness, so it is." And she ran her hand down the crucifix. It's the most natural medieval thing to do. I mean, who wouldn't want to? Of course, the curator came running over in a blind lather. She withdrew her hand in shock and horror. I'm glad to say it did not wither and fall off. Here's another one. Note, they're all quite early, sort of Middle Ages. But I began to notice, as I looked at these more closely, that the fluids from the side of Christ always seemed to be flowing towards the head of Mary. Remember that the fluids were blood and water. Now, I'm told that dead bodies don't spurt blood and water, but birthing bodies do. The Weingarten Missal, again, you can see quite clearly on this that the blood comes out of Christ's side towards the head of his mother. And remember on the cross, he said, "Dear woman, here is your son." So we have a duality of the mother and the son, the male and the female bodies, and Christ in the middle. I'm going to come back to that. It interests me how many of these are images made for women. This is Blanche of Castile's Psalter. And here we see a very vivid imagery of Christ bleeding towards his mother, again with that sort of phallic torso, and behind his mother, Ecclesia, the church, personified in Mary, but here holding the chalice, which will be the recipient of the blood. And I'd also draw your attention to a rather ugly aspect of this era of medieval art. The idealized motherhood of the church was shown as the humiliation of synagogia, the synagogue. So we have here Ecclesia and synagogia on either side, one glorified, the other humiliated, and there are a lot of examples of that, which I won't go into now. Mulieris dignitatem, let's go back to that saying. The Eucharist makes present anew, in a sacramental manner, the redemptive act of Christ. Now, if we think about the one church union, the one flesh union, which it's important to note here, St. Paul is saying that about the church, not literally about married couples. The one flesh union of marriage is a sign, an anticipation, an analogy. Men and women do not become one flesh, but Christ and the church do. Male and female bodies are reconciled in the crucified flesh of Christ. And it interests me that in these images, the arms of Christ extend over the heads of the beloved disciple and the mother. So, am I being terribly far-fetched here to suggest that this is a fertility symbol, that Christ is inseminating his own maternal body because his body is now neither male nor female, but the one flesh union of all humans in Christ? Here's an image of the church being taken from the side of Christ, the way Eve was taken from the side of Adam in the story of Genesis. But what is this wound that the woman is born from? This is Christ's side wound. I don't need to explain, do I? It's just that, guys, when you're saying Mass, we can help you to know what it feels like, but if you can just imagine, a bit of a vagina somewhere about you. Here we have a combination of both images, just in case we're in any doubt. And here we have the risen Christ with the wound of Christ. So there is a fecundity on the cross. There is a one-flesh union of male and female bodies. There is a reconciliation in the maternal body of the crucified Christ, which brings about the healing and at-one-ment, the atonement of that which was lost in the Garden of Eden. I'm going to bring all this together in a startling and beautiful image from the wing of a medieval altar screen. Christ births us from the wise wound of love on the cross, and he nurtures us with his body and blood as a mother does. If we look at this image, what we see is the infant John the Baptist with his mother Elizabeth pointing to the lamb in the middle, which has blood coming out of its breast, saying, "Behold the Lamb of God." If we follow the pointing finger through, we see a child nursing at the breast. And if we look at the figure of Christ, we see Christ taking an apple from his mother. The breast in these days was compared to the fruit in the Garden of Eden. As the fruit brought death to humankind, so Mary's breast brings life to Christ and therefore to humankind. So Christ is taking the fruit from his mother. His grandmother, St. Anne, holds the Word. The Word made flesh is also pointing to the child at the breast. The child at the breast is the only child in the picture not with a halo on. Now, this is a totally obscure painting. The curator of the art gallery it's in Cologne doesn't know anything about it. But it was intended to be looked at during Mass. It was the side wing of an altarpiece. And my own speculation is that the child at the breast is the child referred to in the New Testament who is still fed on a diet of milk because it's not mature enough for the real meat of the gospel. And so all of us are called to see ourselves as humble, small, needing nourishment from Christ, babies at the breast, not yet ready for the meat and substance of the heroic life. But for all this to gain sacramental meaning, for the experiential realities of birth and nurture to become sacraments of the presence of Christ, do we not need female bodies in all their fulsome fleshiness? And this is her image of Mary with the lily uprooted and cut in half to show its reproductive organs. So we've a little way to go before we get there. The quest for an incarnational Trinitarian theology, deeply rooted in the goodness of creation, must attend to the significance of gender if it's to be faithful to the wisdom of its own tradition. Gender theory dissolves the moral certainties and sexual binaries of bourgeois Christian modernity and ushers in a new and as yet unknowable future. It invites renewed reflection on what it means to say with St. Paul that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. Language clothes the naked human animal with gendered personhood made in the image of God, and theology springing from the graced creativity of contemplation opens our imaginations to the myriad possibilities of gendered loving and being that stream between the two poles of reproductive necessity. Sarah Coakley refers to gender's mysterious and plastic openness to divine transfiguration, so that the fixed, fallen differences of worldly gender are transfigured precisely by the interruptive activity of the Holy Spirit, drawing gender into Trinitarian purgation and transformation. Two-ness, one might say, is divinely ambushed by threeness. Can the Church find forms of expressiveness which would incarnate the hopes and yearnings of women's souls within the modern Church? Can the Church find a space of positive sacramental significance for the female body, rather than seeing it only in negative terms as a limit to what can be accommodated within the sacraments? I'm going to end with a short reflection called The Closed Door and the Open Wound. Pope Francis, the church is called to be the house of the Father, with doors always wide open. One concrete sign of such openness is that our church doors should always be open, so that if someone moved by the Spirit comes there looking for God, he or she will not find a closed door. With regard to the ordination of women, the church has spoken and says no. That door is closed. After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here your hand and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who did not see and yet believed." Thank you.
Our great thanks to Tina for a spectacular talk, full of great variety and new imagery. And thank you for introducing us to the new pastimes of counting genders in papal documents and spotting penises and vaginas in medieval art, which I'm sure many of us will continue to pursue. And we wish you very well in Rome on the 1st of October.